So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my adventures with Android Wear and Jetpack Compose. Now, just a little bit of a disclaimer first up. I have only been playing around with my Wear adventures very briefly, so, you know, save all your tricky questions for the Q&A after. If this is going to work, let's turn that on. So I have this shiny new toy. I got one of the new Pixel watches. You know, I ordered it, I think at like 2 a.m. or something, as soon as the pre-sales went online. You know, I always have to have the new thing, so I have it. It just buzzed me. Somebody's probably sending me a message. So it does buzzes. I track my fitness on it. It tells me the time. Not really sure what else it does. So, you know, it's pretty cool. I look like I'm cool. But I don't really know what else to do with it. So last time I spoke here, or I think it might have been the time before that, I talked a little bit about my hobbies. You might remember me talking all about board gaming. I mean, that was so last talk. I'm not going to talk about board gaming again, but one of my other hobbies is doing craft. So I like doing crochet, cross-stitch, these sorts of things. It's really good to, you know, have your hands busy and be away from the computer screen for a while. So, you know, it's nice to do something a bit more analog. But, you know, I still do have to try and inject some digital into my analog activities. So I want to make this scarf, right? And this is really pretty. Can't wait to make it. It's been a plan all year to make it. I've just got busy writing these talks. But, you know, if you've ever tried a project like this, if you're into making crafts, you might imagine that it has a pattern like this. There's a lot to keep track of. And there are things on the market that allow you to keep track of which row you're at, which you know, colour you're using, which pattern. And these, you know, sit on your finger, they look a bit dodgy. There's some things that sit on your needles, which fly off across the room, as has happened to me. So I thought maybe I could make a watch app for it. You know, if the user's sitting there doing stuff with their hands, they can just be tapping on their wrist if they already own a watch. And of course, I wanted to use Compose. It's our new favourite thing and we love it, as we found out earlier. So I made a stitch counter app, and here's a little GIF of it working. So this allows the user to put in different projects they're working on. They're like me, they have many unfinished projects. And then they can create different row counters and go through and see their progress, and then reset them when they need to. Just take my word for it, if you haven't done these sorts of projects, this is something that's useful. So, pretty simple idea. How did I go about doing it? So, using Jetpack Compose. So firstly, a few key things that I found out when I was investigating this. Using Jetpack Compose for Android Wear is the preferred approach over Views, now that's been released. It's Wear OS 2 and 3 compatible. Apps, tiles and complications work with it, as well as with or without a phone connection. And there are Wear-specific Jetpack Compose libraries. And for this talk, I'm just focusing on building the UI and what's that I found different or interesting when comparing to building a phone app. I'm definitely not going to cover all of the different ways you can build an app for Wear, but that might be part of a future talk. So if there's anything interesting here to you, tell me, and I'll write a blog post or something on it. So talking about those different libraries, for an example, we have these different libraries for Wear. So instead of using the material library for Compose, there's a Wear-specific one. Same with navigation. You need to use the Wear-specific navigation library. There are some of the libraries that you can use in conjunction. So the foundation one you can use in conjunction with the regular phone app. Here's an example of the navigation. So you can see in my GIF here that I'm using a swipe dismissible nav host. So the user can navigate around the app and dismiss the different screens just by swiping. Kind of similar to the gestures we have on a phone, but you do have to use a different component for this. Here, called swipe dismissible nav host. Looks pretty much the same as what you might see on a phone. Takes in a nav controller, start destination, some composables. Pretty straightforward. So what about other common components that we might see? So if we have a look at the button definition here, you can see it's very similar to what we might see on a phone. There's only a few little different, slightly different parameters. And many of the components that you might use all the time, like text, chips, etc., are very similar. but you do have to think of them in a different way. So for our buttons here, for example, what we might do usually is have a button with text that we might use on a phone app, but on a Wear screen, it's very small. We need to use buttons that only have a single icon, maybe a couple of characters of text, but certainly not the words that we might see on a phone. So here are some examples, just the X or a cross, play button, that sort of thing. And the general guidance from Google is that they want actions that are well understood by users and don't need that text label. So you really need to think about the way you're building your app. You know, do you need this button? What is this button achieving? How many of them do I need? So you can't just directly translate your phone app UI to a Wear app. You need to really think about it. And of course, watches are primarily for time. That's what we want to see when we usually glance at them. And we don't want users to swipe away our app they might be sort of using so that they can view the time. Otherwise, you know, they might forget to come back to our app and uninstall it. So there's a component called time text. And this enables you to display the time at the top of the screen all the time. This is quite useful because it means that users could be using your app and they can see the time, you know, whether it's a fitness app, my stitch counter, it's great. It also enables you to put a little bit of context or a little bit of extra information with that time. For example, on the right there, the navigation app has a little bit of the time to the destination, 12 minutes 48 in that image. So that enables you to give that bit of extra context. So we can see in my app, I use it to give the page context. So project, the counter, where they are, or the app title in terms of in the homepage, just so they know what they're looking at. You don't want this to be a terribly long piece of text. That Google do recommend that you only take up a quarter of the screen. So how do we go about building this one? So just as like in the phone, we have the scaffold. So this takes in various items in different slots that we can use to build our scaffold for our screen. One of those is the time text. So just use a time text composable. This has two slots, which enables you to have a start linear content, which is that context at the start of the screen. And the linear content is for the square or the rectangular devices. So you can see here, I've got the style. I'm using a state just to pass in the value I want. And that's right at the front there. Then there's also the starting the curved content. So this provides that nice curve that matches what the watch has around the curvature of the watch. And this you can use a curved text style. Having these two separated means you could have different text, different styles for both of them, depending on your use case. It's pretty straightforward. Then it also has a feature where you can hide it, and as you're scrolling, it will disappear. You don't want to have your content behind that text because otherwise, you know, it might obscure what you're looking at. So you can just hide it using a scaling lazy list state. So what's a scaling list, you might ask? It's how we can scroll on such a tiny screen. So a scaling lazy column is a column that as the user moves the scroll, the content just slightly gets smaller as it goes up the top or at the bottom and fades away a little bit. So these bits at the top get smaller and faded. We can see this in my GIF here. If you have a look at the pink chips, as they get behind the time text or near the bottom, they start to fade out and get a little bit smaller. This means that the items that are right in the center are really the focus of the user. So they know what to click and they don't get distracted. How do we implement this? With the scaling lazy list column. Pretty much like our lazy column just before that we might use on the phone. So we've got our list header, we have our items, and then we can have our footer at the bottom. I've got an add project button. Pretty straightforward. So what's some interesting things about this is this auto-centering. So this allows you to set the offset you want when your list is loaded and how the user can scroll. So with the default, if you have a look at the way I'm scrolling here in my GIF, the first item is what is centered. Anything that is above it or below it can be scrolled, but the title can't get lower than that center point. And that's because the default is item index 1, so that item will always be centered and you can't scroll down any further. This is the case which most people would have with a small list header that's not very important to the actual content. but it means it's not going to take up extra space off your list. If we try with an item index here of 0, we can see that the item header can be scrolled down. So you can play with some of these things depending on what your UI is. If you want to have a bit more of an elaborate header, you might want to be able to have a custom auto-centering so that you can center on your header. But by default, your first item will always be in the center. So another thing to look out for is we want to simplify user alerts and confirmations. When people are looking at their app, they're looking really quick. You need to make sure that what they see is really clear and they can interact with it really well. So there are some inbuilt dialogues that you can use, alerts and confirmations. So the alerts just lay over the top of your content, disabling all the other content until you dismiss them. And our confirmations have an automatic timeout. So you can, and you can tweak these as needed. You can also make custom dialogues if you would like to. But these ones provide really useful slots and make the development quite easy to do these. Here's some examples. So for an alert, just create an alert composable, add your title, pops in the slot there. And then we have a negative and a positive button. Lays it out nice in the center of the screen and is easy for the user to tap. For our confirmation, again, just a confirmation composable. It has a timeout, which on timeout will call our function that we can do to dismiss the dialogue and do any other cleanup we need to do. You can also change this timeout so it will always behave the way you want. But there's a useful default in there. And this again takes in some useful things like icons and our content. And you want to make it as simple as possible. So what about user input? Let's go to something that's a little bit more complex. So how do you type on such a tiny, tiny screen? It is quite difficult if you haven't tried it. So there's a couple of ways that a user can put in their input. And that can be using voice to text with dictation, using keyboard, or using emojis. And some or all of these might be useful for your app. And a fun fact at the moment, and I was thinking about asking this during our Q&A, is I haven't noticed edit text is available for Compose. Maybe it's coming soon, or maybe I just haven't found it yet. That could be also a thing. So at the moment, I'm launching my edit text functionality just using a button, which is quite good because you don't really want the user trying to select a little individual form field in there. Who would want to put a form inside a watch anyway? So how do we go about doing this? So you have to remember the state of the value you want to get from the user. There's an input text key just indicating, giving you a note of where this text is coming from. And then we have to create an intent. So this is using a remote input intent helper. You then create that intent and pass what configuration you want. So allowing emojis, or you could disallow them as well. And adding in your IME action type, so done for mostly. So you build this intent, and then you pass it into an intent helper and get those extras. It's all in the documentation. So then what we do is you do something that we've used all the time on phone apps, is launch an activity for a result. This is just using the Compose version of this. So what we're doing here is starting an activity to take in our intent, get the user's input, and then pass it back to our app. So we don't even have to worry about the keyboard ourselves. We don't have to worry about moving the screen, how it's going to be laid out. It's going to be full screen over the top and allow the user to enter their information and pass it back. So here you just get back the results as a bundle like you might do in a phone app. You can then save it to the state. And then when you want to launch this feature, you just need to launch this just as you would any other intent. So we can see how that behaves here. The user clicks the button, they can go and choose their input method and then enter their text. So I don't have to worry about any of those buttons at all. So another thing that we've sort of seen with apps is there's a lot of circles. And I think this is because, we've got the nice round Pixel watch, but also on other devices, Apple, there are also circles as well. So we want to look at how we can make progress indicators really useful. So as we see, circular progress indicators are used for all sorts of things. Your media that's playing, your exercise and fitness goals, or a timeout as your if you've accidentally called the emergency services. So we can just use a circular progress indicator here, and this is something you might be used to from as a loading wheel that you use in a phone app, but you just don't have to have an animation. So for this, you pass in the progress. You can set your stroke width, set your indicator colours and the track colour. And then we've got the start angle and end angle. So this enables us to display our progress not under our nice little time text that we added before. And you might look at these numbers and think, why have we got 3:15 and 2:25? This is something that's done me for ages, and I tried to work out why my circle was not appearing where I expected. It's because the 0 degrees is actually at the 3 o'clock, not at the 12 o'clock, which you might expect. So that's why you have to do a bit of maths to work out where that's going to be. And by default, the 270 degrees is where it will start, which is at 12 o'clock. So it is a little bit confusing when you're suddenly trying to work this out. So some other things to watch out for, just in my opinion, again, new to this. So some tricky layout things, and this took a bit of a shift for me to think about this. So it's a bit of a new way of thinking, especially when designing for a circular device, even though my designs are fairly simplistic. When laying out different components, you don't get to see all of your components full width except the one right in the middle. They're always going to be cut off. So you can't necessarily have everything 100% of the width. You need to think about moving things in. And having a margin or padding that is a static DP value doesn't really work because you've got different device sizes. You'll see some examples in a moment. So using some percentages makes life a lot easier. And so from the Google Docs, the design advice is always design for the smallest supported round device first, which just happens to be the Pixel Watch. And then optimize for larger devices and square screens if necessary. And they also suggest to define these outer margins as percentages rather than these absolute values, just so that they can scale proportionally depending on the device width. So we have a look at an example of this. This is my counter screen. So I used the preview so I could show you where everything was bounded. So you can see here that I needed to split this up and use percentages to get the width of my components, rather than have them all 100%, because I was messing around for ages with these two buttons at the bottom, the edit and the reset buttons, that no matter how I placed them, they always seemed to be at the very edges of the screens. And then I realized that the full width was a lot larger than my screen. So I needed to make sure I left a spot for the time text. Then I've gone with a 75% on the top and the bottom, and then a 95 in the middle because I've got that circular progress indicator. So by going back to percentages, I think it was a lot easier, and I now need to go back through the rest of my app and fix some of these things up. And we need to think about all of the devices. So I was designing, of course, for my Wear OS small round because that's the one I have. But if we have a look at what happened on the large device, it looks okay. There's a lot of extra space going on there. The rectangle and the square look a bit ridiculous. So I think I need to do a bit more work for that. And hopefully maybe buy myself a new watch to test with as well, if I don't want to play with the emulator. But as you can see, I'd want here to have maybe a square progress indicator or some other way of showing the progress rather than the round circle. Another thing is knowing about the arrangements. So if you've been playing with Compose a lot, you know about these horizontal arrangements and vertical arrangements. This was something that I know how to do, but remembering which one I need to use at any particular case can be quite tricky. And I found this really useful blog post from Vitor Ramos about this. He had this great diagram, which made life a lot easier if I can just look at that diagram and go, okay, this is what I want. I want to do arrangement spaced around, for example. Because trying to remember space between versus space around versus space evenly can have quite a big effect on a small device, and specifically a round device. So you really want to know what you're doing. So I definitely recommend get yourself a diagram like this, or grab this one and use it in your little cheat sheet. So some other useful things. The code labs are always a good place to start. There's also the training wearables guide. And there's a pathway as well for Wear development. And there's the Wear OS samples. So if you're getting started with a Wear app or wanting to give this a try, I really recommend using the Compose Starter project. If you try and create a blank project through Android Studio, it's very blank. There's not much there at all. And I actually found it much more useful to use the Compose Starter project and then modify it for my own use because there were more examples and then more scaffolding and things that got me up to speed a lot quicker. There's the Compose Advanced Starter project as well, and this has some really cool, interesting things. So you can dip in and out of that and grab some of the features. You can have a look at Horologist. So if you've used Compose, you'll know about Accompanist, which is a library that has SDKs in it and examples that are not really ready for prime time yet. Horologist is the one for the Wear OS apps. So you can see here in my little screen grab here, it's got like a date picker, time picker, some cool segmented progress indicators. I've got my eye on that square one. I think that one might be very useful for me. So you can grab some things out of here and use these. They may or may not get moved into the primary SDKs, but something good to look at. And also there's YouTube videos. So I found this one, From Mobile to Wear OS, quite useful. And the Wear OS deep dive into app architecture was super useful. So I recommend checking that out as well. And that's pretty much it.